The man sitting across from you just destroyed his entire reputation with 3 words. He doesn't know it yet. Hell, you didn't even notice it. But Machiavelli would have seen it instantly. That microscopic crack that reveals everything about who this person really is when the pressure hits. And once you learn how to understand these very cracks, which I am about to reveal for you, you'll possess what Machiavelli called the deadliest advantage. The ability to see someone's true nature before they've finished their first sentence, and how to use it for your own gain and power. Today, I'm giving you a rulebook so powerful, you'll never again mistake weakness for strength or loyalty for deceit. By the end of this video, you won't just know how to spot weak men, you'll know exactly how to handle them, how to turn their flaws into your advantage, and more importantly, how to confront the weakness within yourself. This isn't just a video, it's a full blueprint for transformation. One way or another, it will make you stronger. And that, my friend, is my promise. You won't walk away from this as the same person, only stronger, sharper, and far more dangerous. This isn't about cruelty. This is about survival. This is about understanding human nature so deeply that you can navigate a world full of people who would rather die than admit what they really are. The inversion. Why everything you know about strength is backwards. Here's what nobody tells you. The strongest-looking people in your life might be the weakest. And the quiet ones you've been ignoring? They might be the only ones worth trusting when everything falls apart. Machiavelli knew this. He had to. One mistake in reading human nature meant death. One wrong judgment about someone's character meant watching your allies become your executioners. So he developed a system. 3 specific behaviors that weak men cannot hide, no matter how skilled they are at pretending. These aren't obvious signs. These aren't the dramatic breakdowns you see in movies. These are the tiny, unconscious habits that leak out when someone's guard is down. The split-second reactions that reveal years of hidden insecurity. The patterns that predict exactly how someone will behave when their world starts crumbling. Machiavelli spent his entire life studying one question. How do you identify who will stand with you when the world burns, and who will run the moment things get difficult? His answer wasn't found in grand gestures or public declarations. It was hidden in 3 specific behaviors that weak men cannot help but display. These behaviors are so subtle, so unconscious, that most people miss them entirely. But once you see them, you can never unsee them. And once you master this knowledge, you'll possess something most people will never have: the ability to see someone's true nature before they've even finished speaking. The 3 pillars of weakness. Every weak man is a fortress built on quicksand. The moment you apply pressure, everything collapses. But here's what separates the wise from the foolish. The wise know where to press. Today, you're going to learn exactly where those pressure points are hidden. The first behavior: the desperate need for approval. Let me tell you about the first behavior that instantly exposes a weak man. The compulsive need to justify every decision, every action, every thought that crosses his mind. You've seen him before. He's the man who can't say no without a 10-minute explanation. He's the one who defends choices nobody questioned, who over-explains simple decisions, who turns every conversation into a courtroom where he's both the defendant and the lawyer. Machiavelli observed this behavior in the corridors of power and recognized it immediately. This is not a man seeking understanding. This is a man begging for permission to exist. Here's what's really happening when someone constantly justifies themselves. They're revealing that their sense of self depends entirely on external validation. They cannot make a move without checking if the world approves. They cannot trust their own judgment because they have no internal foundation to stand on. Think about this for a moment. When was the last time you felt truly confident about a decision? Did you spend hours explaining it to others? Did you need their agreement before you could proceed? Or did you simply act, knowing in your bones that you were right? Strong men make decisions and accept the consequences. Weak men make decisions and then spend their lives trying to convince everyone, including themselves, that they made the right choice. Machiavelli wrote, "A prince must be a fox to recognize traps and a lion to frighten wolves. But the man who constantly justifies himself is neither fox nor lion. He's a sheep, bleating for the approval of the very predators who would devour him." This behavior reveals something deeper and more dangerous. A man who needs approval before he acts will never be trusted with real power. Because power requires the ability to make unpopular decisions, to stand alone when necessary, to move forward even when the crowd is screaming that you're wrong. The next time you hear someone explaining their actions unprompted, defending choices that don't need defending, or seeking validation for decisions they've already made, you're not witnessing strength. You're witnessing the slow-motion collapse of a man who cannot trust himself. But that's only the beginning. The second behavior is far more insidious, far more dangerous. It's the kind of weakness that destroys families, ruins businesses, and topples kingdoms. And it's hiding behind the most innocent mask of all: kindness. The second behavior, weaponized kindness. The second behavior that exposes weak men is perhaps the most dangerous because it masquerades as virtue, weaponized kindness. This isn't genuine kindness. That's a strength. This is something far more sinister. The use of niceness as a shield against confrontation, a tool for avoiding responsibility, a weapon for manipulating others into compliance. Machiavelli encountered these men constantly in the political arena. They were the ones who smiled while their enemies plotted, who agreed with everyone to avoid making enemies, who never took a stand because taking a stand meant risking disapproval. Here's how you spot this behavior. The weaponized nice man is agreeable until his niceness fails to get him what he wants. Then the mask slips, and you see what was always underneath: resentment, bitterness, and a rage that comes from years of suppressing his true feelings. You've seen this transformation before. The man who's always the nice guy until someone doesn't appreciate his niceness. The colleague who's helpful and accommodating until someone gets promoted instead of him. The friend who's supportive and understanding until you succeed in ways he hasn't. This behavior reveals a fundamental truth about weak men. They cannot handle authentic relationships because they cannot handle authentic conflict. They use niceness as a way to avoid the discomfort of real human interaction, the messiness of genuine disagreement, the growth that comes from standing up for what you believe. But here's the most dangerous part. These men build their entire identity around being good. They tell themselves they're kind, moral, better than those aggressive people who actually speak their minds. But their kindness is conditional, strategic, and ultimately selfish. Machiavelli understood that a man who cannot say no cannot be trusted to say yes when it matters. A man who avoids all conflict will collapse the moment real pressure arrives. A man who needs to be liked by everyone will betray anyone to avoid being disliked. The truly strong man can be kind, but his kindness is chosen, not compelled. He can be generous, but his generosity doesn't come from fear. He can be accommodating, but not at the expense of his self-respect. When you see someone whose niceness feels performative, whose agreeableness seems desperate, whose kindness disappears the moment it's not rewarded, you're looking at a man who has never learned to respect himself, and therefore can never truly respect others. But there's a third behavior, more desperate and more revealing than the others. It's the behavior of a man who fears being invisible more than he fears being wrong. And when you see it, you'll understand why Machiavelli considered it the most pathetic weakness of all. The third behavior, the performance of significance. The third and most devastating behavior that exposes weak men is what Machiavelli called the performance of significance, the desperate need to be seen, acknowledged, and validated at all times. You know this man. He's the one who can't experience a moment without documenting it, who can't have a thought without sharing it, who can't achieve anything without making sure everyone knows about it. He lives his entire life on a stage, performing for an audience that doesn't care as much as he desperately needs them to. This behavior reveals the deepest weakness of all, the fear of being forgotten. Machiavelli observed this in the courts of Renaissance Italy, where men would destroy themselves for a moment of recognition, where princes would start wars just to have their names remembered, where the fear of insignificance drove men to acts of spectacular stupidity. Here's what's really happening when someone constantly performs their life. They have no internal sense of worth. Their value exists only in the eyes of others. Without attention, without recognition, without the constant validation of being watched, they cease to exist in their own minds. Think about the people you know who fit this pattern. They're the ones who can't sit quietly in a room without checking their phone, who can't have a conversation without steering it back to themselves, who can't witness someone else's success without immediately trying to one-up it. This behavior is particularly dangerous because it's so easy to manipulate. A man addicted to attention will do anything to get it. Lie, exaggerate, betray confidences, sacrifice relationships, even harm himself if it means being the center of focus. Machiavelli wrote, "Men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities. But the man who needs constant attention has made attention his most present necessity. He's a puppet waiting for someone to pull his strings, a weapon waiting for someone to aim him, a tool waiting for someone to use him. The strong man builds in private and reveals in public. The weak man performs in public and collapses in private. The strong man's worth comes from within. The weak man's worth comes from the applause of strangers. When you see someone whose entire identity depends on being seen, whose mood shifts based on how much attention they're receiving, whose actions are always calculated for maximum impact rather than maximum effectiveness, you're looking at a man who will never be truly powerful because he's handed all his power to anyone willing to watch him perform. Now you know the three behaviors, but knowing them is only the beginning. The real question is, what do you do with this knowledge? How do you protect yourself from these people? How do you use their weaknesses to your advantage? And most importantly, how do you make sure you're not one of them? The Machiavellian response: turning weakness into advantage. Machiavelli didn't just identify weakness, he weaponized it. He understood that in a world full of weak men, the person who could recognize and navigate these weaknesses would possess unlimited power. Here's how he turned each behavior into a strategic advantage. For the approval seeker, Machiavelli learned to become the source of validation these men craved. Instead of being frustrated by their constant need for justification, he became the person who listened, who nodded, who made them feel heard. And once they associated him with the approval they desperately needed, they would do anything to maintain that connection. He didn't argue with their explanations. He absorbed them. He didn't challenge their justifications. He appeared to accept them. And in return, these men gave him their loyalty, their information, their complete devotion, never realizing they were being controlled by their own need for approval. For the weaponized nice man, Machiavelli offered these men exactly what they were seeking through their false kindness: a place to belong, a group to be part of, a leader to follow. He gave them the safety they were trying to create through their agreeableness, and in return, they gave him their compliance. He understood that these men were not truly kind. They were afraid. So he became their protector, their shield against the conflict they couldn't handle. And grateful for this protection, they became his most devoted servants, never questioning his methods because he had given them what their weakness craved: a world without confrontation. For the performance addict, Machiavelli became the audience these men needed. He offered them the stage, the spotlight, the recognition they were desperately seeking. He let them perform, let them be seen, let them feel important. And while they were busy performing, he was busy directing the performance to serve his own ends. He understood that these men were not seeking genuine significance. They were seeking the feeling of significance. So he provided that feeling, while ensuring that their need for attention made them completely dependent on his approval and completely predictable in their behavior. The art of psychological dominance. This is the art of psychological dominance that Machiavelli perfected. You don't fight weakness. You feed it just enough to keep it alive, just enough to keep it useful, just enough to keep it loyal. You become the dealer of the drug they're addicted to. You become the source of what they cannot provide for themselves. You become indispensable to their emotional survival. And here's the beautiful, terrible truth. They will thank you for it. They will call you their friend, their mentor, their leader. They will never realize that you've turned their weaknesses into your strengths, their needs into your leverage, their desperation into your power. But Machiavelli had one more insight, perhaps the most important of all. This knowledge is useless if you don't apply it to yourself first. Because the most dangerous weak man is the one looking back at you from the mirror, the one whose weaknesses you can't see because you're too busy performing them. The one who might be reading this right now, nodding along, thinking about all the weak people in their life, never realizing they're describing themselves. The one who might be watching this right now, nodding along, thinking about all the weak people in their life, never realizing they're describing themselves. The mirror. Examining your own weaknesses. Machiavelli believed that self-awareness was the foundation of all power. He understood that you cannot spot weakness in others if you cannot spot it in yourself. You cannot manipulate others' need for approval if you're desperate for approval yourself. You cannot navigate others' false kindness if you're hiding behind your own mask of niceness. So let me ask you the questions that Machiavelli asked himself every day. When you make a decision, how long do you spend explaining it to others? When you choose a path, do you move forward with confidence, or do you immediately begin building a case for why you're right? When someone disagrees with you, do you stand firm, or do you start justifying, explaining, trying to make them understand? If you find yourself constantly explaining your choices, you're revealing that you don't trust your own judgment. You're showing the world that you need their approval to feel confident in your decisions. You're displaying the first behavior of weak men. When conflict arises, what's your first instinct? Do you face it directly? Or do you try to smooth it over with niceness? Do you state your position clearly? Or do you try to find middle ground that makes everyone happy? Do you set boundaries? Or do you accommodate others at the expense of your own needs? If you find yourself always trying to be agreeable, always trying to avoid confrontation, always trying to be liked rather than respected, you're using kindness as a shield against reality. You're displaying the second behavior of weak men. How much of your life is performed for others? How often do you share your achievements, your thoughts, your experiences? How much of your self-worth depends on the recognition of others? How do you feel when you're ignored? When your contributions go unnoticed? When you're not the center of attention? If you find yourself constantly needing to be seen, constantly craving validation, constantly performing your life for an audience, you're revealing that your sense of worth comes from external sources. You're displaying the third behavior of weak men, the path to strength. Machiavelli's solution was not to eliminate these tendencies. That's impossible. The solution was to become aware of them, to catch them in action, to stop feeding them before they could control you. Instead of explaining your decisions, practice silence. Make your choice and live with it. Let your actions speak for themselves. Stop seeking approval and start building conviction. Instead of using niceness as a shield, practice directness. Say what you mean. Set boundaries. Accept that not everyone will like you, and understand that this is not only acceptable, but necessary. Instead of performing your life, practice building in private. Focus on internal growth rather than external recognition. Measure your worth by your own standards, not by the applause of others. This is not about becoming cruel or selfish or arrogant. This is about becoming genuine. This is about developing the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself, the kind of confidence that doesn't need to be validated, the kind of power that doesn't need to be performed. The ultimate advantage. When you master these insights, when you learn to spot weakness in others while eliminating it in yourself, you possess something that most people will never have: the ability to see reality clearly. You'll no longer be fooled by confident-sounding people who are actually desperate for approval. You'll no longer be manipulated by people who use niceness as a weapon. You'll no longer be impressed by people who mistake performance for substance. Instead, you'll be able to identify the truly strong people, the ones who are comfortable with silence, who can handle conflict without losing their composure, who don't need constant validation to feel worthy. And most importantly, you'll become one of them. This is the Machiavellian advantage, not just the ability to spot weakness, but the wisdom to transform it, in others and in yourself. Not just the power to avoid being controlled by weak people, but the strength to become the kind of person who doesn't need to control others because they've learned to control themselves. But there's one more thing you need to understand. One final insight that separates those who merely read about power from those who actually possess it. The difference between knowledge and transformation. The implementation. From knowledge to power. Reading about these behaviors is not enough. Understanding them intellectually is not enough. Even spotting them in others is not enough. The real power comes from transformation, from using this knowledge to fundamentally change how you move through the world. Machiavelli didn't just study human nature as an academic exercise. He studied it as a tool for survival, for influence, for power. He understood that knowledge without application is worthless, that insight without action is just entertainment. So here's what you're going to do. For the next week, observe without judgment. Watch for these 3 behaviors in everyone you encounter. Don't try to fix them or expose them or manipulate them. Just watch. Notice how often people explain things that don't need explaining. Notice how often people use niceness to avoid difficult conversations. Notice how often people perform their lives for validation. For the next month, observe yourself. Catch yourself in these behaviors. Notice when you start over-explaining. Notice when you use agreeableness to avoid conflict. Notice when you're performing rather than being genuine. Don't judge yourself harshly. Just notice. For the next year, practice the opposite. When you catch yourself explaining, practice silence. When you catch yourself being fake nice, Practice directness. When you catch yourself performing, practice authenticity. This is not a quick fix. This is not a life hack. This is the slow, difficult work of becoming a stronger person. But it's the only work that matters. Because in a world full of weak men pretending to be strong, the person who actually becomes strong, genuinely strong, authentically strong, possesses unlimited power. The final truth. Machiavelli's greatest insight wasn't about politics or warfare or manipulation. It was about human nature. He understood that most people are driven by weaknesses they don't even recognize, controlled by needs they can't articulate, limited by fears they refuse to acknowledge. But he also understood that this doesn't have to be your fate. You can choose to see clearly. You can choose to grow stronger. You can choose to become the kind of person who isn't controlled by desperate needs or hidden weaknesses. The three behaviors I've shown you today, the need for approval, the weaponization of kindness, and the performance of significance, these are not just ways to identify weak men. They're mirrors reflecting the weaknesses that could be controlling your own life. The question is, what are you going to do with this knowledge? Are you going to use it to judge others while remaining blind to your own weaknesses? Are you going to use it to manipulate people while remaining weak yourself? Or are you going to use it for its highest purpose? To transform yourself into the kind of person who doesn't need to manipulate others because they've learned to master themselves? The choice is yours, but choose wisely. Because in a world where weakness is rewarded and strength is rare, the person who chooses strength, real strength, not the performance of strength, holds all the power. That's the Machiavellian way. That's the path to true power. That's how you stop being controlled by weak people and start becoming the kind of person who doesn't need to control others. The mask always slips. The weakness always shows. The only question is, when yours is exposed, what will people find underneath? If this opened your eyes to the hidden weaknesses that might be controlling your life, if this gave you the tools to see through the masks people wear, then you're ready for the next level. Subscribe now, because I'm going to show you exactly how to build the kind of unshakable strength that doesn't need to announce itself, doesn't need to be validated, and doesn't need to be performed. The kind of strength that speaks in silence and commands respect without demanding it. Hit that notification bell, because what I'm going to reveal next about authentic power will change everything you think you know about influence, leadership, and control.